All right. Welcome, everyone, to our July session of Science on the Sound. My name is Emily Bjornskar Aquarium, and I am joined by Mark Tagal, who is IBSS senior aquaculturist. And we are going to listen to him talk about Surf Smelt. So, without further ado, Mark, I will let you tell us all about your Surf Smelt story.
All right. Well, hi, Emily. Thanks for having me. Like Emily said, my name is Mark Tagal, and I'm going to tell you a story about Surf Smelt and the work that I've been doing with Surf Smelt here in the Puget Sound region. So, I am the senior aquaculturist at a company called IBSS. As a senior aquaculturist, I work with just that aquaculture, fish husbandry, restoration aquaculture, production aquaculture. And in the case of working with Surf Smelt is developing aquaculture methodologies for some toxicology research. Surf Smelt are an important indicator species, and scientists can use Surf Smelt to tell how healthy the water is. My connection to that project is doing the laboratory rearing of surf smelt so they can compare and contrast what's going on in the wild with what's going on in the lab. I work for a company called IBSS. If you want to find out more about the work that I do or about IBSS, you could go to their website. At first glance, you're going to come across a bunch of like cybersecurity and enterprise, IT and software development. Just work through all that, go to the next pages. You'll find the Oceans and Coast Division. That's where I work. IBSS is basically a contracting agency. So they have a lot of task order employees that work with federal, state, and tribal educational organizations. We have employees that are picking up trash in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands. We have task order employees that work with NOAA's ocean acidification program. We have other guys working in the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the National Weather Service, Department of Defense, educational activities. So wherever in the feds that you have contract workers, IBSS supplies a lot of those workers. In addition to that, I am lucky enough to be able to chase down grants individually. So this year, this season, I guess, I am working on an EE Blue aquaculture literacy grant where we talk about the Merwar seafood. There's the rockfish recovery program with NOAA in Puget Sound, where I'm working with the Point Defiance Zoo and Aquarium on some rockfish husbandry. And then we also have an educational component with that where we go and talk to school age kids about rockfish and all the great things that rockfish do. And we were also involved in the Salish Steed, starry flounder. We're looking at land-based recirculating aquaculture of starry flounder here in the United States. Starry flounder are a high-value fish imported from South Korea in the U.S. We want to see if we can do some of the culture here ourselves. Some of the work that we're, or this talk that we're doing, it was partially funded through the past 15 years. The CDOC Society, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. And there's some continuing work going on with Western Washington University and the University of Washington. So, and IBSS is also generous enough to let me continue to work on smelt. So they cover a lot of my time going out and doing a lot of this really cool smelt research. So today we're going to be talking about surf smelt. Surf smelt are a small 10 to 20 millimeter long little silver fish. And the key thing that we're going to take away from this is they spawn in very shallow water. And we're going to go over the story of how I got into working with surf smelt, and then just kind of the trip it's been on the past 10 to 15 years. So here's a illustration of a surf smelt to get a pretty good idea of what they look like. Long cigar-shaped body, really silvery, just built for open water speed. If you were to think of, wow, what's a good bait fish, surf smelt would probably pop right up. And they're a good bait fish. Everybody loves to eat surf smelt. So surf smelt is in Puget Sound. They are a recreationally important fishery. They have a small but extremely dedicated group of recreational fishers that brave the elements to go out and catch surf smelt. They catch them in a method that's called dipping or raking. And they basically wait for the schools to come within shoreline distance, and the schools either swim into their net or swim in between them and their net, and the fisherman just walks backwards and they catch and get a net full of fish. There is also a small commercial fishery in North Puget Sound for surf smelt. The fish that are caught commercially mostly go to human consumption, although occasionally people buy them for bait. They're excellent salmon bait. But most people that are getting the surf smelt, they do so because they really like to eat them. Surf smelt are a delicious fish. It's a little bit of work to get into them, but it's well worth it. These are a couple of dishes that I have made. One dish that my friend Erica made. She's a professional chef. It's pretty versatile. It lends itself well to just kind of fried, sushi, Mediterranean grilled. It is a really, really tasty fish. And it's not just people that are eating them. Surf smelt make up a group of fish called forage fish. Commonly, you would call them bait fish. Bait fish are fish that aggregate in really huge numbers. They're small, they're silvery, and everybody likes to eat them. They're preyed heavily upon by other marine fish, by birds, and by marine mammals. The important thing with forage fish is they are a link from the higher level, larger predators to the giant abundance of zooplankton and phytoplankton that are in Puget Sound. I did some quick, off the top of my head, calculations to just the biomass of zooplankton in Puget Sound. If you take just the top 3 feet of water throughout Puget Sound, you would probably find more than 1 billion grams of primary productivity. So 1 billion grams, that comes out to like 250,000 pounds. But that's just in the top 3 feet. You go down another 3 feet, you add that volume again. But all of that is not readily available to larger predators like whales and birds and seals and even salmon. So it takes something like a forage fish to feed on all those small little microscopic bits of plankton. They accumulate the energy that's stored in that, and then they in turn are preyed on by larger predators. And so they're an important food fish for the higher trophic levels of what's out there in our marine environment. So just some of the guys that like to eat surf smelt: rockfish like to eat surf smelt, seagulls. The guy up in the upper right-hand corner is a river otter. Whales consume forage fish. Harbor porpoise and seals are all really reliant on forage fish in general, but surf smelt in particular. Because of that, there is a lot of interest in researching forage fish. The National Marine Fisheries Service, Department of Fish and Wildlife, nonprofit groups like the Sea Dock Society are really interested in just what makes forage fish tick. It's important to understand these things so we can understand the health of our waters of Puget Sound or of any of the marine environments. Surf smelt actually occur from California all the way up to Alaska. So where does our surf smelt story begin? It begins here, but it doesn't start out with surf smelt. It actually starts out with this guy, the Pacific herring. So from the Columbia River north, The Pacific herring is what would be recognized as the king of forage fish. If you're talking to someone about like what's a bait fish up in in Oregon, in Washington, and Alaska, herring are what's going to come to mind immediately. Down in California, that would probably be sardines or anchovies, but all of them are as important as forage fish. There's extra special attention paid to herring in our area, um, because and because we pay extra special attention to herring, scientists, they know how to capture them, they know how to spawn them, they know a lot about the life cycle, and just what makes these fish tick. And because of that, there's a wealth of information they've been able to use to understand what's going on in our waters, when our waters become unhealthy, when it's indicators when our waters are thriving. Scientists have a really good understanding of how to spawn herring, how to incubate the eggs of herring, how to hatch herring, and how to look at all the different aspects of larval growth with herring. One of the reasons why they know so much about that is because of one of the greatest natural disasters ever to hit U.S. waters. About 30 years ago, the Exxon Valdez tanker ran aground in Prince William Sound, and that was prime spawning ground for Pacific herring. And so there was tons of research done on how are we going to fix this mess. And so Prince William Sound was a massive spawning ground for Pacific herring. And so a lot of research went in. One, like right off the bat, a lot of them were dying. What was really important was what are the sublethal effects? What's going to happen with this population after the oil that we can see is cleaned up? And so a lot of research went into looking at herring as an indicator species, and they would focus on developmental aspects of what was going on with herring. And herring is still an important indicator species 30 years later. They're still looking at the effects of what the remnant crude oil is doing to herring. They look at what stormwater now is doing to herring. They got herring pretty well mapped out as to what's going to go wrong with it. The sublethal effects that are having on them, the developmental anomalies in the cardiac and respiratory functions, are all indicators on the health of the sound, and when this stuff is used in litigation, that forage fish in general, but herring specifically, are one of those target fish where they talk about it. So about 10 years ago, those people that are looking at all of that work, namely these guys right here, NOAA's Ecotox group, WWF's Ecotox group, they said, okay, we've done a lot of work with herring, and we know all of these things that are happening in the herring. Let's start looking at some other fish. So 10, 15 years ago, they said, hey, Mark, we want to bring another fish up from the bullpen. We want to get another forage fish and see if what's happening to herring is happening across the board to all forage fish. And while forage fish kind of occupies a similar niche in the ecosystem when they're adults, when they're smaller, they're in very different areas. So they said, we want to try this with surf smelt. So Mark, you think you're up to the task? You think you can raise surf smelt for us? I said, yeah, let's give it a go. How hard can it be? We've done herring. Like, there's a lot of knowledge on that. Let's go ahead and give it a try. And so we did. We gave it a try. And so the first thing we're going to talk about is the road to spawning. We were going to spawn surf smelt. We were going to do the larval culture in the lab. We wanted to bring the methodology into the lab and see just how surf smelt reacted in the lab. So we knew a lot about herring spawn. Herring are pretty well understood. people have been collecting the eggs for centuries. They were a hugely important part for indigenous people in our area. Plus, herring spawns are massive. Like, you can see them from the air. This picture down here in the bottom right is the result of a herring spawn up in Alaska. And so we figured, well, we've done herring. Smelt won't be that hard. We can give it a go. So we knew how to catch smelt. We knew how to incubate smelt. We just figured, okay, it's not going to be a problem. Let's give it a whack. So we tried to do it the exact same way we did with herring. So we would catch the fish out in open water. We would tease open and take the reproductive material out of the fish and try to spawn them. And it just didn't work. I think I tried this methodology of dissecting out the reproductive material 3-4 dozen times, and we were just getting nowhere. The pictures on the left-hand side are some really well-hydrated herring eggs. They're really spherical. The picture in the middle there is a fertilized herring egg, but the pictures under the red arrows are surf smelt eggs. And you can see they're not fully hydrated. We have eggs of a couple different sizes in there, so they're not mature. The females aren't gravid, even though we were catching them. And it's like, well, this is what a reproductive ready herring would feel like, and it just wasn't working out. You can see the eggs down here are not completely spherical, and the mouse is pointing to this guy right here. Well, that's not even a developed egg yet. So even if we were to get sperm on these eggs, they probably wouldn't fertilize. We kept banging our heads over and over again. It was like, oh, it's just not working. It's just not working. The only thing we knew for sure is that smelt were spawning in a different place than the herring were. Herring are spawning out in the subtidal on eelgrass beds, on rocky areas that are always submerged. But surf smelt are spawning on rocky beaches up the beach. There are times when surf smelt eggs are sitting high and dry. And so looking back at it now, it's like, oh, the answer is simple. But when we were in the bulk of it, it was like, man, how are we gonna do this? This is really hard. It just couldn't, it just wouldn't work out. We knew what good eggs are supposed to look like, because we'd find fertilized eggs out in the wild. The egg on the left is a fully hydrated fertilized surf smelt egg, and the egg on the right is a herring egg. It's like, well, they basically look the same. We know that the surf smelt egg has this little sucker right here, that part is what sticks on the rock, and with herring, the whole surface of the egg is sticky. But we just couldn't get a figure. It's like, why aren't they stick? Why can't we get them fertilized? We can get them stuck to the rocks. And this is an image of a fertilized surf smelt egg that we got it working, but we just couldn't figure it out in the lab at the time. We knew they spawned on kind of like the exact same beaches. Here's a beach where both surf smelt and herring spawn, and the only difference is the herring are kind of out a little bit deeper and the surf smelt are up high and dry. So we'd go out and we'd catch the surf smelt the same way we knew how to catch herring, and it just wasn't working out. The only thing that we knew for certain is that gravelly beaches are not eelgrass beds. And the other thing that we knew for certain is, well, we don't know how to fertilize these eggs. We don't know how to spawn them. So when you get to that point, what are you going to do? Well, the only thing to do is step back and go surfing. So that's what we did. We kind of pulled back. And this part is a 100% true story on how the day that we cracked how to spawn surf smelt eggs. So I went out surfing at Twin Rivers. So the name Surf Smelt implies that those fish like waves. Twin Rivers is a beach that has a lot of waves. So I was out there not so much looking for smelt, but I was like, I'm going to go out and go surfing. This, of course, is not a picture of me. This is just some other guy surfing, but it's a nice wave. But there's me surfing. So I was out there at Twins catching a few waves. And I looked over and I noticed that there were people fishing on the beach. And I'd seen people catching surf smelt before, and I was like, oh, like those guys are catching fish. So when I finished up my surf session, I figure I'm gonna go walk over to those guys, and I just want to check their fish. Like our fish that we've been catching out in midwater trawls they're not all the way ready. I wonder if these guys' fish are going to be any different than ours. So I'm trying to think of a way, like, how can I just, some guy comes up to you and say, hey, can I squeeze one of your fish? They're like, who are you? So I had to figure out, like, okay, what's going to be an in to come and talk to these people. And I saw these two ladies on the beach, and they were cleaning their nets. And so one of those buckets, if you look at the bucket on the right-hand side, it's a Kikkoman soy sauce bucket. And I heard them talking, and they were speaking Tagalog. So I figured that's my in. My dad is from the Philippines. I don't really speak Tagalog, but I can speak Tagalog food. These guys, they're catching smelt for food. So my in was just to go up and ask them, hey, how are you going to cook these fish? And they said, oh, like we just like, whatever, we cook them. And so I threw it, are you going to make sinigang with them? Are you going to make kawilang galunggong? And they're like, you know sinigang? You know these Filipino dishes? I'm like, heck yeah, my dad's from the Philippines. I love eating this. Then I was in. They were so happy that this surfer guy on the beach knew that how they were going to cook them. They said, have at it. Do whatever you want with these fish in the name of science. What are you going to do? And so I said, well, all I want to do is I just want to grab a couple of these fish. I want to slightly squeeze them to see if the females have loose eggs in them and if the males have running milt. And so I did it, and sure enough, they did. And so they were like, when the eggs are loose, they just kind of flow out of the female. This is a little exaggerated. This fish has been dissected open, so the genital pore is not nearly that big. But you can see the eggs are fully hydrated. They're liquidy coming out of her, and the males with very little pressure will produce a little spot of milk. So that's all I wanted to figure out. But they wanted to know, like, well, but then what? Like, what's going to happen next? I said, well, we're going to attempt to spawn them. She said, well, how will you do that? This part is 100% true. You take the ferry over. They have fountain drinks. So I had a fountain Pepsi, and I had an empty cup in the back of my truck. And so I said, well, this is a recreation, but this is how we cracked it. I said, well, I'm going to take a female, and I'm going to try to take some of her eggs out of her, kind of like this. And we squeeze some of the eggs into the Pepsi cup. I said, and then we're going to take the male, and we're going to do the same thing. And so we did the same thing. And they're like, oh, that's really neat. And so then I took the cup, and I rinsed out with water, and I dumped the eggs into the back onto the beach. And I figured that was that. I had found out what I wanted to find out. The eggs at that beach, or the fish at that beach at that time, were runny. We could probably get fully hydrated eggs out of them. I went back. I was cleaning out the garbage in the back of my truck. That Pepsi cup was still back there. And I noticed there were a couple eggs in the cup. So I looked at them under the microscope. Sure enough, they were fertilized. Perfectly spherical. This little kind of darker color over here, that's the cell cap. So that's what's the embryo is going to be there. We had a fertilized egg. So the next day I was like out there with my own gear. I was like, okay, I'm going to go catch fish exactly the same way they caught fish. And so I did just that. But instead of spawning into a Pepsi cup, I brought some actual test tubes out with me. And I spawned the females into the tubes. I spawned the males on top of the tube. I put a little bit of water with it, inverted the cup a couple of times. Sure enough, they were all fertilized. I was like, I think I'm on to something. If we catch the fish out in open water, we are catching great big females, but they're not hydrated all the way. If we catch the fish on the beach when they're pushing up the spawn anyway, they're going to be hydrated. The males are going to be runny. We can do the spawning. And it worked time after time after time. And so we're like, well, I think we've cracked the spawning. We got to get the fish when they're at peak gravidness, and that is going to be on the beaches when they push up. So sure enough, it all worked out. We actually we presented that. We presented at American Fisheries Society. Now we had a methodology for field spawning surf smelt. We had fertilization rates of 95% when we did it right. So we have the spawning part figured out. The next part was incubation. So how are we going to incubate these eggs? Because we knew we had such a hard time trying to mimic herring exactly, we kind of knew in the back of our heads, we're not going to quite do it that way. Surf smelt are little guys that will push way up onto the beach to spawn. And so incubating the exact same way you do herring eggs wasn't going to work out. They like kind of rocky, gravelly areas. They're way up on the high tide line. They're stuck to rocks all the time. So instead of incubating them the way you would do herring, where they're constantly submerged and constantly have water flowing past them, we did the incubation where we would fertilize the eggs and we would make sure that they were stuck to some sort of substrate. And so we kind of did two different ways, two different methods at the same time. We looked at how we were going to spawn them or how we were going to incubate them in controlled conditions out in the wild. And we did that in these egg cups. And at the same time, so here's some of some of the publications we had from incubating out in the wild. The same time we did it in a laboratory setting, and we were successful in both ways. So now we could spawn the fish, and then we could take and incubate the eggs either in the lab or in the field. And so we could use the data gathered from both places to be used for toxicology studies and see how are these fish acting out in the wild? How are these fish acting in the lab? And so we got those two down pat. What's next? Well, right now, come September, some of the surf smelt that I'm collecting are going to be used up at Western Washington University, where we're going to do some of the larval rearing. And then once we get that down, I would say we kind of cracked the code on surf smelt from spawn through metamorphosis and all of the steps in between. Now surf smelt could be another tool in the seeking information on things like climate change, things like oil spills, stormwater runoff, what those are doing to our fish populations, how we can protect surf smelt populations, and how we can repair surf smelt populations if it ever comes up. So that was my journey into spawning surf smelt. And we would have ended it right there, but just last week we went out and I was collecting eggs again for Western Washington University, and we were out at Twin Rivers, and I was lucky enough to see one of the greatest natural spawning events of surf smelt I have ever seen. And in all the time I've been looking for the smelt, I hadn't quite seen spawning like what we witnessed 2 Fridays ago. And luckily I had all my good camera gear with me, so I was able to capture a lot of those photos. And this is kind of their debut. I'm going to share them with you guys right now. So for a while, I've been kind of an amateur photographer, hobbyist. I like taking pictures of waves. I like taking, kind of scenic sunsets and sunrises. Once upon a time, I used to take a lot of skateboarding photos. I used to publish a skateboarding magazine. That ramp that you see over there, that's actually was at my house. It was the TFP house. So I had all this cool photo gear. And so, I lugged it all out with me to the beach, and we were going to take some surf smelt photos. So there was, looking on the calendar, the tide was really good. I expected to see a lot of fishermen out there, and we were going to collect fin clip samples for some of the genetics work that University of Washington is working on. But there was only one guy out there fishing. And he was like, oh man, there's tons of smelt. I don't know where everybody else is here. And he gave me a few of them, and I took samples from him, and then he took off. And so I was just kind of sitting there on the beach, and I was like, well, I didn't get the samples I need. Maybe I'll take some pictures of the waves. We'll see what's going on. The one thing that we noticed different is there were a lot of birds on the beach. And so a lot of bird activity usually means there's a pretty big school of smelt poking around in the water. There was a lot of crows on the beach, which is a little bit uncommon. crows will come down and they'll steal smelt from the seagulls sometimes, but they don't really hunt them themselves. And with no fishermen, and I didn't have my fishing gear with me, I figured, well, I'm not really gonna be taking any material today. Maybe I'll get lucky and I'll see a seagull catch a fish kind of offshore. And so I just kind of posted up and I was sitting there and I was waiting to see what was what. And there were lots of like birds that you don't hardly even see there. Here's some wood ducks. And they were kind of poking around. And I was like, wow, there's a lot of activity here. I bet that school is really big. It's too bad there's nobody fishing because I don't know how we're going to get any of these smelt. So I'll just take some wave photos. Those are always kind of nice. I was taking pictures of the waves, but every once in a while you would notice something in the wave. And you could see these kind of splashes. It's not just the splash from the wave running up and down the beach. And you kind of see activity in the waves. And so this wave here was one that was pushing up the beach. And I was like, oh, there's smelt in that wave. And so with the magic of digital photography here, so let's take this photo. Let's enhance the color a little bit. You can sort of see the kind of reddish browns right behind that first line of white water. Let's go ahead and enhance this section right here. Zoom in on that. Well, yeah, there it is. I can tell there's fish in there. I can see the reds in them. In fact, there's a tail of a fish right there. And there's another one right there. And all those other red spots are all the smells. Like, wow, they're pretty close to shore. I hope they come in more. That'd be really great if I got a couple better shots of them. And the waves would wash out, and man, you really did see them. And this is probably, you can sort of see some of the tails right there in the middle. You see that splash in the foreground. That's maybe 4 or 5 inches of water. It's like, wow, they are really close. If people were fishing for them, they'd definitely be catching them. And then the birds started getting really excited. They were jumping up and down, and they were taking short flights. They were flying up, and then they were landing really quick. And they're flying up, and they were landing really quick. And every wave that was pushing in was bringing us closer to our peak high tide on a full moon. I think it was like a +11 tide. It's like, wow, something's going to happen here pretty quick. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw a crow flying with a whole smelt. And there were no seagulls over there. So he caught that on his own. I was like, wow, if a crow is catching smelt on his own, then they must be really coming up. And so sure enough, they started coming up. A wave would wash in, it would suck out, and there were hundreds, if not thousands of smelt in about 4 to 5 inches of water. It's like, wow, I've never seen this many this close to shore. I've seen one YouTube video with this many fish, but they are really up there. I wonder if the birds are going to start catching any. And then the next wave that rolled in, you could just see them in the wave. Thousands and thousands of smelt riding the waves up along the beach, up into just mere inches of water. They would turn the water kind of that brownish red of the color of their bodies. Like, whoa, they are everywhere. And then you started seeing them flopping out of the wave. You can see that little guy there in the kind of the right getting barreled. I was like, whoa, there's tons of smelt everywhere. Then the next wave that rolls in, I got my 600 millimeter lens. I train it on this one spot where I know where the wave is going to break, and I catch that photo. And so the smelt are jumping out of the wave in an effort to get into centimeters of water to do their thing. And everywhere up and down the beach, we're seeing this spawning activity. And it's not just me with my camera noticing, the birds are noticing because they're just exploding from the waves right in front of them. And then it's on. It's just so much motion of fish spawning, seagulls going nuts, the seagulls catching 3 and 4 fish at a time in the waves that are just exploding everywhere around them. It's just like stick your head underwater, come up with a fish. So everybody was making out. The smelt were spawning, the birds were eating. They were in just really shallow water, and I was capturing these great images of smelt spawning. And it's just kind of this mass spawn. Everybody pushes up onto the beach. The females let loose their eggs, the males let loose the milt, and they just kind of pray for the best. but it's just going on everywhere. Um, Here's another really good image of them spawning. You can see their dorsal fins coming out of the water. They kind of kick their tails, but it's not exactly the same as salmon where they're digging the reds. They're kicking, they're trying to scatter the eggs as much as possible. They're trying to scatter the milt as much as possible. They're hoping for the best. So, and of course, the birds are just having a heyday feeding. But seagulls being seagulls, there's always going to be some opportunistic ones. So, like, one guy would catch them. Those other two kind of darker colored gulls, they could just stick their head in the water and catch their own, but they would rather steal it from their buddies. So we got to see some of that. Seagulls trying to steal from each other. I kept watching. I was just transfixed on the waves. There were thousands of fish coming in, and the tide was just about to start turning. And so I was like, oh, okay, I got a couple more shots of this. And at this point, I was alone on the beach. Lisa had went back to the car because it's a little bit cold. And I was just sitting there with my camera, and I get this feeling like something is watching me. And then I know something is watching me because I can hear it because it's right next to me. And I was like, oh, I hope that's a dog. And I could hear it breathing, but because it wasn't quite like a dog panting, it was more this kind of really excited, like sound. And I was like, uh-oh, what is that? So it's close. It's like 2 feet from me. So whatever animal this is must also be just transfixed on what's going on in the water and just doesn't even notice me. So I kind of just shift my eyes as hard as I can without turning my body. And I just see this kind of blurry image. I was like, oh, okay. At least it's not a bear. I'm pretty sure I know what that is. And at that, a wave washed in and it just goes bolting into the water. I was like, oh, okay. Train my camera on right when he comes out of the water. And so I turn, I go to where I know he's gonna emerge from the water, and I catch this river otter. And he catches 2 and 3 surf smelt at a time. He runs up the beach, he swallows them down real fast, goes back into the water and does it all over again. And then almost as quickly as it began, well, it went on for probably over an hour. I shot over 600 shots that day. But then it turned off when the tide switched. About 20, 30 minutes after high tide, the tide started receding, and the smelt just weren't pushing up the beach anymore. But the evidence of their activity was everywhere. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of eggs were all over that beach. So if you know what to look for, you can see them. If not, here's a little help. There's all those green arrows are pointing to eggs. And the beach was just filthy with them. So that was probably 2 weeks ago. With the temperatures the way they are right now, those eggs probably all hatched. Well, not all of them. A lot of those just became food for seabirds and shore crabs and all kinds of stuff. But the ones that were gonna hatch, have probably all hatched to contribute to the next cohort of surf smelt out there. Then the whole process starts itself all over again. These guys will wriggle out into the ocean. They'll become food for someone. They'll grow up. They'll start spawning. It'll all happen all over again. So I'd like to say a special thanks to Noah's Anna Cagley for letting me tag along on the open water capturing of surf smelt. Noah's Kathleen Neely for helping me do some of the work with writing up what our findings were. My wife, Lisa Tagal, Jamina Garland Lewis. Pretty much all of these photos of surf smelt were taken by me, even the microscope ones. If I appear in the photo, then Lisa or Jamina took them. Some of the wildlife shots Jamina would have taken. WDF&W's Louisa Harding, Jim West, and Noah's John Incardona for 10, 15 years ago, kind of casually asking, hey, Mark, you think you'd know how to raise surf smelt? Let's give that a whack. Commercial fisherman Josh up on North Camano Island for supplying me with fish. And a real special thanks to recreational fishers all over Puget Sound. They have been the biggest contributor of material in terms of fin clips, in terms of knowledge, in terms of eggs and reproductive material. and just the enthusiasm that they feel when I talk to them about what I'm doing. A lot of times you think fishermen are going to be kind of standoffish when you see, people coming in, really questioning their fishery. But for the most part, everyone has been really interested in what we were doing, really supportive of what we were doing. And they really are happy with what we are doing with Surf Smelt, and they all want to know how they can help. So I'm really happy for the recreational fishers all over Puget Sound. An extra super special thanks to the Highline Community College and the Mass Center Aquarium, to Russ, Ariel, and Emily for inviting me to talk about Surf Smelt. We'll also be working on one of our other kind of interactive science things with our EE Blue aquaculture literacy, where we're going to talk about with these classes with oyster culture, and how different styles of growing oysters contribute dramatically to the taste and the texture and the shape of the oyster. It's something I'm working on called the miroir. If you are a kid between the ages of 8 to 14, you can, the Mass Center is going to have summer camps this July. You have to check their website to see if there's still availability. But I will be on site five times this summer to talk about that. Also, at the end of summer with the Mass Dogfish Days of Summer, we'll be down there again talking about all of it. We'll be talking about surf smelt. We'll be talking about rockfish. We'll be talking about miroir of seafood. So come down and see me. If you want to email me, you can find me at mark.tagal@ibsscorp.org. I'm sure or .com. We'll be able to, I'm sure there'll be a link someplace. And with that, thanks for listening. And I guess we'll open up to questions if anybody has any. Oh, so there's Emily. Emily, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. All right. Thank you so much for your amazing talk. That was so great. Those photos of the spawning event were so cool. So if anybody has any questions and you're watching on YouTube, please put your questions in the chat and I can ask Mark. In the meantime, I have a few questions for you. But before we talk about surf smelt, you mentioned with herring that in addition to the eggs being important to the ecosystem, that they are collected for human use. What are those uses? Why are herring eggs important for people?
So traditionally in this part of the world, indigenous people have been collecting herring eggs as a source of nutrition. Because the spawns were so big and they kind of, it was really predictable. They knew they were going to be. One of the traditional ways of harvesting herring eggs were to take a cedar branch, put it in the water, the spawn would go off, and then they would just take that branch out, and then you could just eat the eggs right off of that branch. And I also believe they smoked them, and they occasionally, I think they would use them for certain kinds of bait for, I think, catching crab. They might have done it that way. More modern herring eggs are collected. A lot of times if you go eat sushi and there's little topiko on top of it, it's either going to be flying fish eggs or herring eggs. The method of collecting them is a little bit different. The sushi ones are collected pre-spawn, whereas the traditional one was collected post-spawn. But it was direct consumption for humans is one of the main way they were used.
Very cool. So after when NOAA and Fish and Wildlife were like, okay, we've studied herring, let's study surf smelt. Was there a reason that surf smelt was picked, or was that just a logical choice, or why surf smelt?
So they occupy a really similar role when they're adults. When they're forage fish, they're swimming around out in kind of the pelagic zone, and they're preyed upon by, everybody and their brother eats them. But the spawning is really different. And so when herring are spawning, they're spawning in the intertidal. When surf smelt are spawning, they're spawning on the beaches. And so if you look at things like stormwater events, water, stormwater comes off of our road systems, goes into a storm drain, and that storm drains a lot of time will wash directly onto gravelly beaches. And there's a lot of times there's like creek systems associated with that. And so, and that's where surf smelt are spawning. So because the toxicology groups are really, one of the things that they're most interested in is how environmental pollutions or how things like climate change or acidification is affecting the development of the embryos. And so they're two different zones. And so they can look at, okay, this is how warmer temperatures are affecting the intertidal, and then this is how they're affecting the beaches. And so they're slightly different. And so when you're looking at having tools for all of the forage fish, surf smelt were the next one in line. Eventually, they'd like to follow through, do it with herring, do it with smelt, do it with if I'm hoping one of these months here, they say, hey, Mark, what do you feel about sand lance? Let's crack that code, and so that will be the next one. So the other thing that was really interesting with surf smelt is herring only spawn once a year, whereas surf smelt spawn year round. So they were interested in, one, there's different pollution events going on throughout the year. The other thing that's of interest for a year-round spawning forage fish is the genetics of it. University of Washington is looking at the genetics, like, are surf smelt like salmonids? Do they have home beaches? They know that the fish up in the Straits of Juan de Fuca tend to spawn in the spring to early summer. The fish from Camano Island up to the San Juans tend to spawn from summer to early fall. And then once wintertime rolls around, all the spawning events are going on in South Sound. So there's interest in some of the genetic works. Are they one big superpopulation? Do they break down into individual family beaches? Are they just kind of regional beaches? So that's some of the interest for moving on to a different forage fish. So
awesome. That's great. So our surf smelt, forage fish in general, but surf smelt specifically, currently a threatened species or an endangered species, and what is the prediction currently for their population in the future here in Washington?
So as far as that's one of the things where the genetics is really important, because if you go out and you sample them midwater, well, there's bunches of them. And then if you go sample on spawning beaches, there's bunches of them. But are fish, let's just pick two beaches, beach A and beach B. If beach B is polluted, but there's always fish returning to that beach, is that because of the spawning activity at beach A that's the clean beach and it's just carryover, and those fish are populating beach B? Or is beach B in serious trouble because it's being polluted? And should things be done to, pollution mitigation, or maybe reduce fishing pressure because there's not the same amount of recruitment coming from that beach? So as far as numbers of surf smelt, they tend to seem to be okay for right now. Like a lot of things with our marine life, nothing's ever as good as it was back in the good old days. But they're still spawning on the beaches where they've historically spawned. They do notice things like beach armoring will hurt spawning habitat, and then development on the beaches, of course, will push them away from those spawning grounds. It'd be interesting to find out, as spawning grounds go away, do those fish just pick a different beach to spawn on, or is that location kind of gone? But numbers wise, the good news is they appear to be okay. And also there's a bunch of pristine beaches that don't seem to be affected by pollution. And so that's kind of a success story. A lot of the times when we're looking at them, up in the Straits of Juan de Fuca, there's not a lot of urbanization out there. There's not a lot of pollution out there, and so those guys are doing really good. So that's one of the pluses about working with Surf Smelt, is going out and finding, is like, hey, yeah, these populations are working. It's not all doom and gloom, and then even looking at stuff like up in Exxon Valdez, there's still problems up there 30 years later, but they're all signs of hope. Like, things are cleaning up. 30 years is just a blink in geological time. There's a lot, if we can manage to keep it clean. There are little things we can do to help it rebound. That's some of the restoration culture work that I do, is like, how can we fix some of the things that have happened in the past.
So cautiously optimistic, but we'll see.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Awesome. So you showed briefly how you spawned the surf smelt on the beach. Do you, for surf smelt fisher people who are watching, do you give lessons in how to do that? Is that encouraged if they come across fish that are ready to be spawned?
Yeah, so that is a grant that I have been thinking about, and I would love to chase after here in the future. Is one, we'd have to do the science to figure out, is this a good idea or not? Because if you just kind of go along willy-nilly spawning fish, that's not always a good thing. But it could be. However, it would be extremely easy to train fishermen, like, hey, if you're going to be catching fish on this beach and removing them from the beach, that's okay. That's we're part of the environment too, and we're going to eat these fish. But you could do this one simple little thing that would make their push up the beach, not totally in vain. And if you look at all the pictures of those wildlife, those seagulls were taking thousands of fish off the beach that day. But as a fisherman, and I have showed them how to do it before, and I would love to teach a class in it, is to, like, yeah, when you're catching your fish, instead of waiting to go home to clean them, just clean 24 of them right here on the beach. All you got to do is just squeeze the female into a bucket, squeeze the male into a bucket, swirl it around, put some water in, swirl it around again, and dump it back out on the beach. Those eggs would be acting exactly as how the eggs would be working had the fish just spawned them by themselves and then got eaten by a seagull. And you could potentially leave tens of thousands of eggs behind. And of those tens of thousands of eggs, they might all be eaten by purple shore crabs. But even that is okay, because purple shore crabs are relying on these massive spawning events so they can eat, just like the seagulls and the otters. So by leaving some of that material there, you're contributing to the overall ecosystem instead of removing it and taking it off the beach. So yeah, I would love to do that. So yeah, hey, Sea Doc Society, if you're watching, let's work on that.
There you go. So my last question, and anybody who's watching, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. Otherwise, Lisa, Mark's wife, put his contact information in the chat, so you can send questions directly to him. So you did this as you were talking through the pictures, but can you kind of summarize the feelings you felt when you were on the beach and you saw this massive spawning event, and you're the only person witnessing it, and you had your camera equipment to record it?
It was one of the times I felt so lucky that I brought all of that stuff with me, because I was going to bring, just like, this has replaced my big gear bag of cameras. It's like, oh, let's snap photos this way. But there, if it wasn't for that 600 millimeter 5.6 lens, there's no way I would have gotten that shot. So I felt extremely fortunate that I had the gear. I felt even more fortunate that I was able to witness this thing that I knew happened, but hadn't seen in 2 decades of working with this forage fish. Like, I'd see the evidence of it happening. I'd see the eggs on the beach. I'd see people catching the fish because they're coming close to do the spawning. But to actually see them spawn on the beach, and to see all of this wildlife taking advantage of this spawning moment, was just, it was awe-inspiring. And that was just what we could see on the beach. The same thing is going on below the waves. There are vast schools of red-tail surf perch following the surf smelt around, feeding on them. And then they're right behind that in like knee to waist deep water. There are lingcod hanging out, picking off those surf smelt. So to be right in the middle of these two really dynamic food webs and being able to witness that is, you get those kinds of feelings when you watch, Blue Planet or National Geographic, and you wonder like, man, how'd they get those photos? That must have been, really cool to be sitting right in the middle of that. And I'm the guy getting those photos. I was like, whoa, this really is something. So it was inspiring. It was humbling. And it was also, it gives you a real sense of kind of optimism, because this is a spawning event that's working. And all of these eggs that are getting left on the beach, I mean, there were millions, like literally millions of eggs. Even if only 2% of those survive to be adults, 2% of a million is a big number, So, that, and just being able to sit right there in the middle of it and witness all that was phenomenal. So if someone drops me an email, I actually have a video of a surf smelt hatching from its egg. And I was going to share it on this, but there's a lot of dead time in between what's going on. But it is a really cool video of watching one of those little guys just fight to get out of that egg that he had incubated in for 12, 14 days. And then just with the last kick of his tail, just kind of disappear into the nothingness to go start the cycle all over. So yeah,
that's awesome. I'm
happy to share that with anyone who wants to see it.
Well, that is incentive to contact Mark with any follow-up questions for anyone watching this after the live stream.
Yeah.
Well, that is the end of my questions, and we are just about at the end of our time. So thank you, Mark, so much for joining us for Science on the Sound. And thank you to everyone who has watched the live stream or has enjoyed a replay of the live stream. We will be back with Science on the Sound next month, the first Saturday of the month at 3:30 Pacific time, with Poo Gooders, which is a clean up your dog poop grassroots organization here just south of Seattle. So that will be a very exciting talk as well. And if you have any questions for Mark, please reach out to him. Or if you have any questions for the Mass Center, you can find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, or our website. And so, yeah, thank you everybody so much for joining, and we hope to see you soon.
Yes, thank you, Emily.